hello to all of the Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Today we have a discussion with Oriana Pawlyk, who is the aviation reporter at Politico. And we were just speaking to Oriana before we started recording about having an area of specialty that all of a sudden starts getting lots of national attention and what kind of experience that is. Because we found in the last several months that there's been a cascade of crises in the field of aviation. And all of a sudden, we're in the general public, the consumers, the government watchers, we're all looking to people like Oriana to explain to us what exactly is going on, why, and really what to make of it. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So Oriana, following up on John's intro there, we as consumers and us as politics watchers actually have all kind of noticed that there's been mass cancellations over the last year or so plus. From most recently Southwest Airlines, where folks are just getting last minute notices and not able to go home for the holidays. Can you kind of outline specifically the cancellation problem and not what just happened with the FAA systems? What's going on and maybe why is this happening?
Sure. If you peel back the onion a little bit on what the airline industry has kind of had to grapple with since COVID especially, you can attribute it to a number of factors. And you hear airlines and experts saying, there's been a dichotomy between a couple of push-pull scenarios of why this has happened. One of them is there has been some staffing shortages in the airlines that they're just kind of playing catch up with. What happened during the pandemic was a lot of employees, Congress had mandated that these employees stay in their positions, and they had the payroll support program, which kept them in place to keep funding them. But at the same time, airlines sort of saw the writing on the wall and said, well, we don't know how long the pandemic's going to take. So they started to kind of nudge these staffs and saying, are you eligible for retirement? Maybe you can retire now, and we will kind of fill those slots and these crews later on whenever the pandemic is over. Fast forward to today, again, as I said earlier, a lot of people are still playing catch up with some of these types of employees. And that goes for not just the airlines, but at airports as well. And just where there was a really, there was a tight spot for some of these companies on where they should make investments. So now we are seeing some of that blowback of not being prepared adequately from some of these airlines and residual companies working with the airlines to get people in place fast enough, because a lot of people decided, I'm going to have this quote unquote revenge travel season of where I go to somewhere tropical and warm and great with my family for the first time in 2+ years. So now we're looking at how the airlines are basically just kind of trudging along and trying to get flights on the books, some routes that have been, exponentially increased, and all of a sudden they're not meeting it. So then that's where we see a lot of this, conversation of if they can't meet the demand, maybe they have to pull back a little bit. And so we've seen them do this trial and error over the last several months, the summer being one of them. Of course, the winter holiday was a totally different mess, but the summer holiday was a big test for them. And I believe it was Juneteenth weekend, Father's Day weekend, where it kind of all melted down then for the first time as well, because they had so many flights on the books and they just didn't place crews to aircraft, enough people to get those flights off the ground. So that was the first iteration of it not going as smoothly as planned. And that's when DOT kind of started sounding the alarm bells over a lot of this, saying, okay, you guys have to figure out your schedules a little bit better because you can't do this to customers. But fast forward to now, where you had an airline, Southwest, basically have an entire meltdown on its own, which started from weather, but then cascaded into something totally different. But again, some of that can be attributed to just not being positioned well enough to get some of this done and executed after coming out of this kind of 2-year brain fog of what the pandemic meant to this industry.
There's a lot of that we kind of want to dig into and break down, certainly the pandemic, but let's get to that a little bit later. What I want to ask you first, Oriana, is this crisis that you're talking about with these mass cancellations, the staff shortages, and so on, is it across the entire industry, or is it affecting some airlines much more than others?
Yeah, I think you can see that it crops up for each airline a little bit differently. You see how they try to, for example, like regional jets. Regionals contract with bigger airlines, like Republic Airways and SkyWest and things like this, they're having their own small crises, if you will, going forward with not having enough pilots to fly some of those planes. So what those regionals have decided to do is work with the bigger airlines and say, okay, well, we can't serve this airport anymore because we just don't have the people to fly them. So it depends on who you look to across the industry and what problems they have that are acute to them. And everybody doesn't seem to have the same issue, and it just depends on how they want to move forward or how they look to get bonuses or some of these benefits for some of the people who work for them. But I wouldn't say it's standard across the board on, they're all suffering from the same ailment here going forward. It's a little bit different for everybody.
And does that apply in the same way outside the United States? Is it really a US problem or is it a global problem? How do we kind of compare to the other regions?
Yeah, I mean, over the summer, you saw Europe have a huge problem, and you saw people lining up in airports for miles on end. I mean, I think you can honestly say that Europe had the issue because they really didn't have an employee benefit payroll support like the United States had in over the course of the pandemic. And granted, the US airlines and domestic carriers got rid of people, but they still had some cushion in place to get people back when again travel kind of ticked up again. Whereas in Europe, that did not happen at all. People were basically getting fired. They didn't have the right staffs to put in place again. And when this, again, revenge travel happened over the summer, Europe basically had its own, as a continent, had its own meltdown for how people were trying to travel seamlessly from airport to airport. I mean, you saw baggage getting lost. You saw basically what happened to Southwest over a span of a week happening in Europe 4 weeks. So it was just not, it's still been a global issue, but it's again, a little bit different for everybody. And people are still in recovery mode when it comes down to it.
So, Oriana, we're talking about the impact that the pandemic had, staffing shortages due to airlines maybe not wanting to spend the money on staff that is not necessary, at least months and a year ago or so. And now they're trying to catch up, as you said. That leads me to the question of the margins. One of the arguments that the airlines use for why they aren't adequately staffed up is that the margins are super tight, specifically for this industry. Can you give us a little overview of what is actually going on with profit margins and whether or not that's an argument that's rooted in fact, or is that more just an advocacy argument?
That's a great question. And I don't know if I can answer it that seamlessly, but I know I wouldn't say that it's acutely a problem for this industry with profit margins, because when you hear airline executives and even some of their main trade associations talking about this, they talk about the development of, trying to get margins corrected or rightly moving in the right direction in other industries, including tech, which is seeing, big layoffs in certain elements. And, you have the healthcare industry having also similar issues. So I don't know if you can actually say that it's just specific to one industry. Now, the airline industry is, stands on its own in very and unique and other ways, but I don't know if it's the same way across the board to say, oh, profitability is being hampered by what's going on right now. The country's moving in the direction that it is.
It certainly is. And now this is a follow-up, so not sure how into the numbers we need to get, but maybe what you're hearing from sources inside the government, whether it be DOT, FAA, heck, even members of Congress. But on the outside, you have activists essentially using this airline issue to make a point about corporations in the United States. What really, really sticks out is the Trump tax cuts, TCJA, the airlines then going about massive stock buybacks, and then shortly thereafter, getting a massive bailout from Congress. Please correct me on the numbers. I believe it was almost $60 billion in bailouts that were being discussed initially. So when you're taking a look at this from a taxpayer perspective, you see the tax cuts, you see the government money going to them, and then you see relatively awful service. Has there been criticism from lawmakers, from people inside the government about essentially the airlines putting stockholders and corporate bottom lines ahead of consumers and also not being responsible stewards of that taxpayer bailout.
Absolutely. I mean, you've definitely seen, and I think it's a criticism that comes from both the right and the left when it comes to politics. But you've seen people saying that look at the airline industry and how it's morphed over the last 2 decades. I mean, you had more airlines at the time serving more people, and now the conglomerate has changed and monopolized, and this airline bought this airline, or this airline merged with this airline. There are even some being discussed right now where there's code sharing agreements and places where they could quote unquote partner up. And the things that DOJ and DOT have to look to regulate there when, expanding a merger, for example. But the argument has stemmed from too many airlines are in business with one another moving forward, and who ends up losing. And most of the time, lawmakers make the case that the consumer ends up losing, and consumer advocacy groups say the exact same thing, because if you're not going to get more with less. So moving forward, they're trying to understand how to better, either regulate this issue or whether or not to approve some of these partnerships, only just because what does it benefit with the consumer? And I think you're going to actually see a lot of that debate come up in the next FAA reauthorization bill, which is due by September. A lot of lawmakers that have stood their ground behind a lot of these consumer issues. Senator Markey, Blumenthal, Cantwell, to name a few, they want better provisions for consumers moving forward for an industry that's pretty lightly regulated at this time.
I was wondering about that, and maybe we'll get into that with the labor issues a little later. But specifically for regulations, so you point out some Democratic senators and consumer-oriented regulations. I was hoping you can get a little bit more into that. And also, is there any other type of potential legislation, regulation solutions that would be aimed at specifically, preventing stock buybacks for airlines or preventing certain types of mergers? Is it more systematic approaches to solutions, or is it basically just trying to ensure that the consumer doesn't get just screwed over?
Right. I think that that's obviously the debate coming from all sides, because of course it's not just DOT that's trying to be pulled apart in some of these ways by lawmakers. I think lawmakers also want to see other people, other agencies investigating some of these issues that have potentially led to a lot of the meltdowns that we've seen over the last year and a half. I mean, I think that there's been proposals from the House side of things to introduce legislation to let the Federal Trade Commission and even states' attorneys general to get involved. And if they want to investigate an airline on behalf of their constituents, they can. We haven't seen that just yet because, again, of the lightly or lesser lightly, I'll put it that way, of, regulating this very unique industry ever since the 1978 Deregulation Act went into place for DOT to be the overseer of all airline proposals and things like that. So there are other people who are vying to get into this space. The question is, will Congress allow for it? There are some people who do back that assertion and want to see more eyes, more police, if you will, looking at some of these regulations and looking to basically supplement the things that DOT does right now. Otherwise, will it just lead to more consumers suffering at the airports, or being, on a plane for too long, or diverting, or all these different types of things that happen to you when you begin the point of air travel, from the airport to when you touch down at another gate somewhere else. And no one has a concrete solution just yet, but there have been a few proposals thrown out there to see how just how this could really be expanded upon.
If someone's had their flight canceled or rerouted or any of the other travails that you've mentioned, and you ask that person what they hate most about air travel, they would say having their flight canceled or rerouted. But in ordinary times, if you asked the average consumer what they hate most about air travel, a lot of them would probably say the prices. And if we're talking about regulation, sometimes it's something that ends up impacting consumer prices. if the airlines had to have more obligations to make sure that they're refunding the passengers and so on, all sorts of other things that might be mooted. Of the regulatory options that are being considered, do you think that some of these might end up increasing prices that consumers will have to pay?
I think that if you're looking at some of the things that DOT has proposed in the last few months, they're looking to get rid of these quote unquote ancillary fees of, when is the wool pulled over a customer's eyes for what are they actually paying for when they hit the checkout button when they buy an airline ticket. And they're looking to get not only the airlines themselves, but third party websites and things like that to try to get this regulated a little bit more strictly, just so you're not sending a bunch of money to whomever without knowing where it goes. You have to pay for your baggage, you have to pay for the actual ticket itself, but and sometimes you of course have to pay for when you want to seat your family together on the plane, which of course you've seen lawmakers up in arms about that too. But moving forward, they kind of want to strip away some of these fees or make them more transparent so that way the person knows exactly what they're paying for upfront, or otherwise can go to a competitor and get a flight by a competitor that's a little bit more affordable, or some other means of transportation, of course. So in that respect, I think that I'm sure lots of people will tell you that yes, the price of an airline ticket is astronomical, and how did it get this way? You'll see, airlines talking about how we've tried to move through XYZ things that we've done over the course of the pandemic and trying to basically scrutinize our own ticket prices. But of course, where things stand right now for a lot of Americans, the price of an airline ticket is pretty high. I think you're going to see when that rulemaking comes into effect, probably in a few months, if not years, maybe they'll be able to save a couple cents on the dollar. Whether or not that'll actually change the way that airlines debut their ticket fares is another story.
Oriana, it's always seemed to me like airline prices are a lot cheaper in Europe than they are in the United States, even for comparable distances, and even when you're flying over national borders as a third party national. And, it's funny, I was thinking about Ryanair when you were talking about those ancillary fees and all the hidden fees. They're notorious for it. But even when you add in all of those fees, the flight prices are still something like half of what we would pay in the United States to go the same distance. Is there a good explanation for why the United States in particular has a market where we see prices that are so high, so much higher than in other regions?
I would just say that I think that different governments subsidize different modes of transportation for different countries, of course. I mean, I think you see more investment in some of these transportation modes, because you could say the same for, honestly, train travel in Europe, which is super ubiquitous and a lot cheaper, in my opinion, than some of the Amtrak rides I've taken here myself, or even just taking, a metro train, going a couple stops. And I think that airline prices kind of go the same way based on where we are with companies. I mean, you're going to see where supply and demand also drive that issue. And of course, we saw again over the summer a ton of people taking back to the skies to get to their next destination. So I think the airlines have noticed that. They know to pick up on where we can make a profit here, and this is what we are going to achieve over the next several months or over the next several weeks. And that's where it's a little bit different on what they offer the American consumer versus what European countries might offer their own prospective passengers. So it really just has to deal with some of this either regulation or, of course, just like what governments look to when they subsidize their own transportation markets.
Now, Oriana, you mentioned regulations that have been proposed. I would assume they're in the comment period. Can you get into a few of or a couple, or even one of the major new proposed regulations from DOT to address the relative chaos that we're seeing in the airlines?
Sure. So I think the biggest one is just the proposal that came out in August, which would give passengers a refund, a cash refund, which you don't always get, right? You just sometimes have to bargain with the airline to get a refund. of course, airlines will automatically give you one if your flight is delayed or canceled of up to 3 hours. But most of the time, they offer you a voucher instead, which people don't always use. And now some airlines have moved to get rid of expiration dates for those vouchers, which is nice. But again, people just want that cash back in their bank accounts. Where some of the nitty gritty lies is that, it has to be a quote unquote controllable cancellation that has been done by the airline. Airlines could sometimes argue, oh, well, you know what? This wasn't really in our wheelhouse because the cancellation happened because of an air traffic controller issue. So really, does that mean you get a cash refund automatically? Well, the line is pretty thin there, so you could debate it. What DOT has moved to do is to basically codify some of this language, clear up some of this language to know, hey, this is exactly when I get a refund. It's when I'm entitled to a refund. And I will see that reimbursement back in my bank account by X date. Again, that proposal came out in August, and rulemakings take on average 2 to 3 years to get done. Some of them, of course, could be expedited and work faster. I think we've obviously seen with the Southwest issue that people want refunds, as quickly as possible, and whether or not an airline will honor that. So it's just making this uniform across the board to know that airlines are on the same page when they have to actually issue a refund to a customer. So that's one of the more substantial ones. I mentioned ancillary fees being another. And then, of course, you've seen and this isn't necessarily a rulemaking, but you've seen DOT move with asking airlines to publicly put out there what their policy is to reimburse passengers for meals and hotels, because previously most people wouldn't know that. They would know that the airline owes me something. I don't know what that is, but they have this consumer dashboard, they call it, to tell the passenger, this is exactly what this airline offers as a private business. But we've moved to have you understand your rights, that yes, you do get a free meal, or yes, you do get a hotel stay if the airline has something within its control of a canceled or delayed flight.
So logically speaking, this sounds like these regulations are really focused on specifically protecting the consumer when these worst case scenarios come to fruition. Is there any discussion about these regulations which presumably would drive up the costs for airlines themselves, changing the way that they operate materially, i.e., they don't want to have an instance where they're like Southwest and they cancel thousands of flights and then they have to reimburse people in cash, which could be very costly. So they're going to change their hiring or staffing or emergency staffing practices? Or is the discussion and maybe even some of the pushback that while these regulations will protect consumers through the emergency, the only effect that they'll have on the airline behavior is not this systematic change, but rather a price increase to control for the emergency spending that is likely down the line?
Yeah, so I would say it's definitely the latter. Of course, you've seen Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who's taken steps to try to force airlines to make, passengers whole for their canceled flights. But, you've not seen DOT under his direction do much to remedy the flight disruptions before they even start. It's kind of what we discussed a little bit earlier with, DOT having some of this consumer protection authority, but it's mostly been reactive versus proactive on what it can do. Of course, you've heard consumer groups, especially given the Southwest issue, talk about how, if you just start issuing fines against airlines, perhaps they'd get their act together, but you haven't seen it over the span of the last several months. Of course, you've seen some investigations and DOT asking for some airlines to reimburse passengers about what they did over the pandemic, which was, by the way, essentially over the last 2 years. How are you going to have an investigation on, some things that just happened recently, like the Southwest issue? I mean, you really just have to get your ducks in order and move as fast as you can to get refunds into customers' pockets as soon as possible. That's the basic argument that you keep hearing, especially from lawmakers and some of these advocacy groups and just the everyday passenger saying, I don't understand why it's taken, this catastrophic event for my travel plans to get, a little bit of attention, or more attention, I should say, on some of these issues that the airline industry is facing. Why can't you bring the hammer down? Is the question that's been out there for some time. Again, it's a pretty fine line to walk with the airlines being not so heavily regulated, but there are steps that they are trying on the reactive side, as I just mentioned, to move forward and how DOT deals with the airlines. But as of right now, you're not seeing a ton of proactive consumer authority issues that maybe kind of scare the airlines into getting their act together in the first place.
I feel like we're tying a lot of threads together here to get to the elephant in the room. So we're going to ask you to put on your aviation hat and your politics hat and help us out. So you described the desire by some legislators to essentially disperse the power to investigate airlines to state AGs, to FTC, other agencies. You also mentioned 1978 deregulatory legislation that passed for this specific industry. So getting to Secretary Buttigieg, he just seems like a political fire rod from those on the right to those on the left. They are hitting him like a piñata over these airline issues. And we're not going to get into it, but over supply chain issues and a bunch of things that may or may not be in his control. So let's just focus on the airlines. Does Secretary Buttigieg actually have the authority to do some of these forward-looking, prescriptive things that would systematically change the way airlines are regulated to prevent these emergencies from taking place, or to prevent the frequency with these emergencies that happen? And a second aspect of that is he just getting criticism because it's easy to criticize the head of DOT at this point, and he likely has larger political ambitions and aspirations down the road?
I think it's a little mixture of everything. Does he have the authority? Again, DOT does have broad consumer protection authority. And again, he could work with some of these groups that sit on some of these policymaking committees at DOT to look at ways to proactively investigate airlines who may be in the wrong when it comes to either refunding passengers or the way that they actually treat passengers in other ways by some of these fees that I had mentioned earlier, or deceptive practices, if you will, or even just having a way that DOT gets involved very soon in some of these airline merger agreements that, end up taking some time as well. So these are things that could be proactively done, and could that ultimately change the course of the airline industry? It could. It's whether or not DOT wants to take that step. They've opted more so for a lot of these partnership agreements and talking with airline executives and how they could work together. Of course, you're talking about a time when, as you just both mentioned, in the economy and the state of where it's been the last 2 years, I mean, cajoling the airlines might be seen as a better, massaging effort to work with some of these companies versus honestly past administrations that have been a little tougher in some of their language, and who knows what could happen based on what a DOT secretary says. Does that, if he does bring the hammer down in some of these things, I will hold airlines accountable, but he says it a little bit stronger, or he makes some sort of, veiled threat. What does that do to these companies' stocks? What does that do to how people perceive these companies? And I think that based on what you've seen from this administration, they're walking, again, a fine line of trying to opt for something like a partnership versus instead of going forward and again bringing that hammer down of being tough or tough worded on what they're going to do next. So there are things that could be done, again, from the proactive stance. And like you had said as well, with the FTC getting involved, or maybe allowing having legislation that allows states attorneys general, or even just saying, DOJ could partner with us to investigate some of these things. But, you just haven't really seen it. And as you mentioned, the political aspect from his aspirations, he has said that right now he's not thinking about anything else. He's not even looking to fill Senator Stabenow's seat from Michigan, which is now where he's a resident. But, anything could really change by 2024. Anything could change by tomorrow. And whether he has those political aspirations either to be in the political realm that way or even run for president again. So, you've seen some Democrats who have tried to shield him in that way because they perceive him to be the future of the Democratic political party. Every day is a new day, and they're taking it one step at a time. Because right now he has had a couple of attacks on him over the past year. You mentioned supply chain. The rail strike, of course, was another one. And now this issue with Southwest and the FAA meltdown that happened just last week. There's a couple things that have been thrown his way, and they're trying to slough off some of these attacks.
Oriana, you mentioned the Michigan Senate race. I did not know that he was now a resident of Michigan. And I remember they put out that letter saying, I hope you will not bandy my name about as a potential candidate for this seat. And I thought, well, I wasn't doing so until you put out this letter. Anyway, we have been hearing these criticisms of Secretary Buttigieg, and it's very clear that many of them have a political rationale behind them. Rivals from the other party, rivals in potential future primary races. But I'm much less interested in what those critics might be saying, given that clear rationale. I'm more interested in knowing what the people at the Department of Transportation think about his tenure so far. So what do they think? What are they saying? How do they evaluate his performance, the career civil servants inside the department?
I've heard, and this is just from having conversations with the folks over there that I've grown to know over the last year and a half. I mean, I believe that, there was, I will say this, there was some, what his relationship with the FAA has been interesting. Of course, that's what I cover. He got involved in issues that you never would think that a transportation secretary would be so keenly aware of. To reminisce last year, the 5G aviation issues, whether or not 5G would tamper with radar altimeters as planes were coming in for a landing. That was something that he got involved in. And again, it was very technical and very wonky. And it was something that apparently he had very much enjoyed getting involved into and, trying to remedy some of what the FAA had been asking for from the FCC and how to move forward on, making sure planes can safely land at hundreds of airports across the country. So I think that wowed a few people that this is something that, again, why would someone like Pete Buttigieg get very interested in a very technical issue like that? But he did, and he had facilitated some conversations to try to move it forward. Is that a resolved issue? Well, that's to be determined. Whoever wants to argue that, that's still obviously ongoing. I think he surprised people, and I think he has surprised people in positive ways.
So what's interesting to the people in the department then is kind of the opposite of what you might have guessed. It's not that he's doing too much PR and spending too much time campaigning. It's actually that he's diving into nitty gritty, almost micromanaging type issues in a way that's caught them off guard.
Yeah, in some aspects, absolutely. But I could only speak to really that FAA issue from my perspective and from my reporting. But that was one thing that, again, you just wouldn't expect a secretary to be that fine tuning an area like that requires so many eyeballs on this very technical issue, and working with engineers and talking to engineers and seeing what the repercussions might be and just really digging in on an issue like that.
Noticing that he's paying attention to these kinds of issues as the secretary gives us an opportunity maybe to compare him a little bit to his predecessor, Secretary Chow, because she was someone who had great experience at the department before becoming secretary. I think that she'd been the assistant secretary when George W. Bush was president before becoming secretary when Trump was president. Is there a similarity or a big difference in the approach that Buttigieg and Chow have taken in this job?
I will say Elaine Chao predated my time in talking about some of these transportation issues. I think for both of them, though, it depends on who you're talking to, whether you're going to get criticism or whether you're going to get praise. And I think that that's fair to say for both of them, because I've always heard that on both sides of the aisle, especially. I actually saw Elaine Chao a couple weeks ago on the Hill. So it's not like she's still not making the rounds with lawmakers or talking with people, for her prospective interests. And I think Buttigieg does the same. So I think that that's why, in that way, they might be comparable, that they're beloved in some ways or not seen as doing an adequate job in others, or, it just comes with the territory of being in a cabinet position that way.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that, and you have touched on this, I feel like, but it should just be asked outright. I want to get into his lack of experience in transportation. Maybe we can focus it on the airlines and how that has impacted his job as Secretary of Transportation. Now, from my understanding, I was a policy advisor on the Hill. I look at cabinet secretaries and they're very high level folks. From my perspective, they don't need to be subject matter experts. They're out in the media explaining the work that the organization's doing. They're out in congressional hearings. They're out meeting with members of Congress. They're dealing with the White House led staff and interagency staff and the big major decisions. But from your perspective, has Pete Buttigieg being new to transportation materially impacted his efficacy, or is his willingness to jump in and learn about these new topics kind of mitigated a lot of the concerns that many folks had?
So again, I think you're going to get a criticism that you're going to get from the people who already, didn't want him for the job or didn't like him for the job. But you've also seen him being, on TV, doing TV media blitzes when there's a crisis or when there's something good to say as well. I mean, he's essentially been hopscotching around battleground states for the last year, handing out infrastructure checks that came from the infrastructure law that was passed. So he's kind of turned that on his head going forward with a lot of these. I'm going to be the forefront. I'm going to be the face of a lot of this conversation surrounding infrastructure, surrounding transportation, surrounding supply chain, and also on the back end of, some of these crises that we've seen in the last 2 months. I mean, with the Southwest meltdown, he was in front of the TV cameras when the FAA issue, which is acutely in his wheelhouse because DOT oversees FAA, he was again in front of the TV cameras. I think that's another positive thing that you've heard from the people who champion him, because they say, whether it's good news or bad news, he's going to be out there and he's going to be talking about either what the government's doing and its power, or, the opposite of, what the government has potential to do with what has happened or manifested over the last year in this sector. Again, you mentioned somebody doesn't have to be a subject matter expert, and he may not have been, but it seems that he potentially has learned pretty quickly on how to get spun up on that and, move forward as best he can. I think that's something that, again, you'll hear his major champions say about him, but at the same time, you will still have critics on whether or not he's actually proposing any actions to remedy some of these situations that, the American public has seen in the transportation sector in the last year.
Oriana, is it really a good thing for the Department of Transportation to be getting attention in this way, though? I mean, perhaps there's a reason why other presidents have appointed people of a lower profile into this job. And before I go any further, I want to say that I slightly misspoke when I talk about Secretary Chao, who wasn't the assistant under W. Bush, but was the deputy secretary under George Bush. Mm-hmm. But back kind of to the question, a lot of these sorts of agencies don't really want to get very much publicity, because if they're getting it, it often means that there's a crisis. I'm sure that the Department of Homeland Security or the Secret Service certainly wish that they were getting much less publicity on the issues where they are getting publicity. And maybe having someone who is rather determined to draw a bit more attention to the department is something that the department might not really be as happy about.
Well, I mean, you want your government to be boring, right? That's how people all the time think about government. They don't want to have a media darling, or they don't want to have a celebrity or somebody who has zero experience running, a certain agency. But I mean, at the same time, I don't, for some of what's been happening over the last year, especially for this for this department, a lot of the legislation passed over the last year had to deal with this department. I mean, the infrastructure law was pretty huge and pretty consequential for many states. That will be consequential for many states over the next 10 years or so, if not longer, with just some of the projects that people now are requesting to put on the books. I mean, if somebody is going to have to be a speaking person or just putting your face to the name on getting some of the information out there to the American public on what this law does for their community. Again, you mentioned like nobody wants to actually be at the center of attention for a random regulatory agency, but it is something that happened in terms of getting huge provisions done in the infrastructure law that you kind of need to spell out for people what this means for them and their livelihood. And so I think that that's what you've seen him do. And you've just seen, and not just him, you've seen the Biden administration and also just folks who work in the Department of Transportation talking about it and meeting with governors and meeting with, tribal leaders and local leaders about how this is going to work for them, or how this is really going to bring their community into the future with some of these advancements in bridges and roads and things like that have never been there before or are decades old. So that's what you get that's a little bit different, and it comes with the territory, especially when you have something so monumental and consequential for these communities at the forefront for the Department of Transportation to discuss. And that's clearly what's happened here.
Yeah, as John was asking about, staying out of the media, I did a quick Google on former secretaries of transportation, and I found out Elizabeth Dole was a secretary of transportation, which I did not know.
There's also Andrew Card, who became White House chief of staff. There's been a couple names, mostly not such big names.
Yeah, and Ray LaHood, John and I, Oriana, we interned on the Capitol Hill. At the same time, we didn't know each other in the summer of 2012, and LaHood gave us all a intern speech. But that is neither here nor there. I want to pivot to something that you have hit on a couple times: the FAA nationwide grounding of planes. So this happened, I believe, last week, and what we've been told is that it was human error. So could you kind of get into what actually happened and whether or not this was just a one-off or a symptom of a larger problem at the FAA?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start here with saying, is the FAA dealing with outdated and old equipment in some of the systems that it has? Yes. Is this known? Yes. When people were talking last week a lot about how this came as a surprise, I mean, a lot of the systems that the FAA uses are, they haven't either been revamped or updated in some time. You heard about this specific system, the notice to air emission system. It dates back to the 90s, and some elements of it might be even older. It was a two-pronged issue. Was this a one-off, and is it systemic? It's both. It came to a head when they were trying to regulate some sort of software issue with the system. And then what happened was the system stopped spitting out these notices. The notices are needed for pilots to basically get updates, commercial pilots, in the air on, anomalies that happen during flight. Sure, weather is a part of it, but it's other things too. Weather is mostly done by, aircraft radar, which are way more sophisticated nowadays. But there's other notices like, hey, maybe you're going to have to deviate your flight a little bit just because this route wasn't as best planned as we thought it was, and there's something coming up in that way. So this is where you should move to in the next half an hour. That's essentially what they're giving you as you're flying a plane. So what happened with those pilots is they can't take off if you're not going to be able to give them those notices while they're flying, hundreds of passengers up in the air, which is why the FAA issued a ground stop for, I believe it was 106 minutes. But then the backlog started to pile up, and you see all these planes that were sitting on tarmacs or couldn't push off from the gate because we have been told I can't fly because I'm not going to actually get some of these notices on what's ahead for me on my commercial flight. So again, did the FAA know that this system is probably outdated and needs a revamp? Sure, you've heard FAA officials testify to Congress for many years now that they need to update a lot of this software and just get a little bit more in line with how they look at the national airspace system and the technologies that will take them into the future, as well as the technologies that are probably needed presently, to be quite honest. But in this case, it was a one-off. It just started a cascading issue of thousands of flights canceled because it created this increasing backlog of this glitch happening. And you started to see planes just basically line up and not go anywhere.
So you just mentioned outdated technology, which I'm sure that career folks and experts would like to update. So we're going to ask you to put your political hat back on again. I remember, for the listeners, they don't need to hear that I used to work for a Tea Party member, but one of the most difficult bills to pass was the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill, even just to get normal funding through the process of the House, because House Freedom Caucus folks do not like this spending. It's just a big bill, and they see the top line number, they freak out, they use it as a political piñata. And I remember Chairman of the Transportation Committee, Bill Schuster, at the time, who now is I believe a lobbyist for transportation airline companies. He would take a lot of crap and guff from those Freedom Caucus members. We're talking back 15, 16, 14. I guess the question is, the House is clearly very divided. You mentioned just one angle, FAA technology modernization, which you would assume could use a lot of funding. In September, when this issue comes up, is there going to be, in your perspective, a bipartisan push to actually allocate and appropriate the levels of funding to address these issues? Or are we more likely to see a kick the can down the road approach due to the political dynamics and specifically the outsized power that the House Freedom Caucus types, the Chip Roys of the world, currently hold in House legislation?
Yeah, I think that's going to be, I think regardless, it's a debate right now because of everything that's happened in these back-to-back issues of the FAA notice to air mission system, plus coupled with the Southwest thing, even though they're not related. You've seen two major meltdowns that have gotten Congress's attention because it's gotten the American public's attention. So whether or not you get the kick the can down the road scenario, it just has to do with how quickly legislators want to get the FAA reauthorization bill out the door. The last one was late, the 2018 one, and this one is due in September 2023. Will they hit that mark? Great question. But again, it's definitely going to be debated. I don't see how Congress lets this one slide, and I don't see how both sides of the aisle or one party let it slide, particularly because again, you have American consumers who are banging on the doors, if you will, but I'm saying that as they're probably calling and flooding their lawmakers' offices with, what are you doing about this? But they're irate. They're upset that this has happened. And imagine if somebody was a passenger who was dealing with the Southwest issue, only to fly 2 weeks later, and then all of a sudden they're stuck because of an FAA grounding issue. I mean, I would personally be irate, and that's what you're getting. So the lawmakers cannot wiggle away from dealing with this issue and looking at the numbers and crunching those numbers and seeing, hey, you know what, the investment needs to be made, because if you don't make the investment, this is what we're going to deal with for the next X amount of years. And I just don't think that with where the FAA wants to be as an agency and the things that they have to deal with over the next 5 years, and even 10 years, I mean, you can talk about all the things that they have to regulate too, while also dealing with safe airline issues. There are proposals where lawmakers looking to get all these electric aircraft into the sky by 2028. There are talks about how drones can now do delivery from point to point in certain states. So you're talking about, not just getting a computer system, an outdated computer system, updated for regular things that happen on an everyday basis to move seamlessly, but the FAA also has to deal with all of these new futuristic things coming into the airspace at the same time. And it's all going to fall apart if you're dealing with old, outdated issues on one end, but talking about something that sounds like Futurama, incredible, Jetsons type aircraft coming at the same time. It's it's split. It's a dichotomy of how do you do both at the same time? You have to kind of move it all at once and move it all together. And I think that that's the debate that they're going to have, and obviously press on some of these issues.
Well, Oriana, some of those Jetsons ideas sound very exciting, perhaps in more the medium to long-term future. As we kind of wind down our conversation here, let's look to the near-term future. So the issue that we kind of kicked off with about these mass cancellations, you mentioned that it was mostly concentrated around these heavily trafficked holiday travel periods. So could you tell us what's the next travel period that we're looking forward to where there might be a crunch? What's the next one on the horizon?
That's a great question. January and February are kind of, President's Day weekend. People like to get out of town for that one, but would I say it's a really big one? Probably not, but around, the springtime holidays, Easter holiday, Mother's Day, Father's Day, those are types of things that are coming up in the spring that I think, and of course, at the end of the month, if you want to really go for how many people might be going to Mardi Gras this year, I'm not sure in February. But yeah, those are types of holidays that people should be on the lookout for when, they're getting ready to head to the airport and get in the TSA line. Anything that's really around those types of celebrations and people getting together again, unlike the Christmas holiday or some of the summer holidays that we saw where it was a pretty big backlog there as well. So it's coming up, but not too soon. We still have January to get through, which always feels like forever, and February, of course, before some of these things kind of culminate.
So this is the very last question then, and it's really just kind of a big status check on the state of the airline industry. You talked about how these kinds of crises really began around the time of the pandemic. They have their root and their heart in the pandemic, all the staff shrinkages and layoffs and retirements and furloughs. Are we really out of that now? I mean, how far have we come towards staffing up our industry as we head to that next holiday period that's on the horizon? Where are we? How close are we to the staff capacity that we need to be
prepared? I think that really just depends on the airlines, because if you're going to say, hey, I can staff X amount of people for X amount of flights, then great. If airlines know how to schedule their people well and not use antiquated scheduling systems, like in the case of what happened with Southwest, if they can match up getting people to their destinations and the crews that get them there, then great. That's kind of what you need to see. It's not just, throwing bodies at the issue. You also have to be able to execute it with an action plan that makes sense, kind of like looking at essentially like a register of the things you need to do on your checklist before you take off. And again, if airlines can basically right size the amount of flights that they can carry out in a certain time frame with the number of people that they have, if they get that right, then things should be operating more seamlessly than they have in the last several months. And that's just really the question. I mean, like I said, you can't just throw people at the problem, especially if the people don't become this cog in the machine, if they don't know what they're doing, if they're inexperienced or any of these types of things. If you just get everybody to the right point and getting them to the right schedule, the right route, then it should be all good. But it's a question of whether or not they can execute that too.
I guess it's really sort of two questions that we talk a lot and across industries of whether we're back to normal. But then in this industry, we've also got that question of whether normal is good enough.
Or if normal will ever really return.
Indeed. Or perhaps we'll get to post-normal with all of these electric flying drones and all that. Oriana, thanks so much for joining us. This was really informative discussion, something that, as we're saying, is acutely felt by consumers. But at the same time, we don't always know exactly what's happening. We know that, our flight's been canceled, but we don't really know why. And hopefully everyone who's listening, including us here, the hosts, have learned a bit more about how things really operate and why things are the way they are and why we're seeing what we've been seeing. Thanks again. We appreciate your specialty and your expertise on this very interesting topic.
Absolutely. Anytime. Had a good chat.